The day the lawyer read my grandfather's will, the whole dining hall laughed. Not quiet laughter, not polite laughter, but the ugly kind, the head thrown back, table slapping kind that comes from people who have waited a long time to see someone humiliated and have finally gotten their wish. 20 boys and men sat at those long pine tables in the Greenbrier County poor farm, and every one of them turned to look at me. Someone snorted stew through his nose. Someone else clapped, slow and sarcastic. The lawyer, a thin man who had driven up from Lewisburg to read 7 sentences, looked at me like I was a problem he hadn't been paid enough to solve. Mrs. Della Pettigrew stood at the head of the room with her ring of keys at her waist and her iron gray hair pinned flat against her skull. She had a way of looking at you that made you feel like a number in a ledger, something to be accounted for, managed, and eventually crossed out. When the laughter finally died down, she folded her hands in front of her apron and said, in a voice that carried to every corner of that cold room, "Well, Thomas Rourke, your granddaddy left you a hole that breathes cold. The court's done with you. Try not to freeze in it." I was 15 years old. I had been at the poor farm for 9 months, which was longer than I'd stayed anywhere since my father died. My mother had been gone since I was 4. Childbirth fever after delivering a sister who never drew breath. My father lasted another 10 years before a rolling log crushed him at a timber landing. After that, I learned what it meant to be passed around like a piece of furniture nobody wanted but couldn't quite throw away. 3 months with my half-brother Wade, who told me a boy was another mouth, and put me out before the first snow. 6 weeks with Aunt Lena, who needed help with her laundry, but didn't need opinions from a boy who read too much. And then the poor farm, where I'd learned that hunger could be measured out in portions and called discipline, where I'd learned that asking questions was the same as causing trouble, and where I'd stolen every scrap of printed paper I could find, almanac pages, old newspapers, a water-stained arithmetic book someone had thrown away. I had $1.82 to my name, a wool blanket stamped with the county's ink, and now, according to the Commonwealth of Virginia, I had 32 acres of limestone ridge in the mountains near Ridgewater, including a cavern the locals called Silas's Cold Mouth, and a shack that was probably more hole than shelter. The lawyer explained it like he was reading an obituary. The land was so rocky you couldn't drive a plow 10 feet. The cave was so large it breathed cold air pouring out of it in summer, drawing warmth away in winter like a chimney that never closed. Everyone knew you couldn't heat a cavern that size. Everyone knew my grandfather Silas had tried for 30 years and failed. He'd bought the whole ridge at a tax sale for $7, which should tell you what anyone with sense thought it was worth. The boys at the far table were still laughing. One of them made a gesture like he was shivering. Mrs. Pettigrew had already turned away, her keys jingling as she walked toward her office. The lawyer was packing up his papers, but I stood there in the middle of that dining hall, and I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hope, I'd learned better than that. Something else. Something that fired in my chest like a furnace door swinging open, a cave that breathed cold air. I'd read about caves in a geology pamphlet I'd found in the church donation bin. I knew they held steady temperatures, winter and summer. I knew cold air was just air. It could be blocked. It could be channeled. It could be used. And I knew that a grandfather I'd never met had spent 30 years working on something the whole county called madness. Something about that made me want to see it for myself. If you want to find out what I did with that breathing cave in the mountains of West Virginia, how a 15-year-old orphan with nothing but a borrowed flour sack turned a hole in the ground into something that sheltered an entire valley, then subscribe to this channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Because what I built in that darkness, what I made where everyone said nothing could survive, is a story that still lives in those mountains today. I left the poor farm 2 days later. Mrs. Pettigrew didn't try to stop me. I think she was relieved to have one less name on her ledger, one less mouth to account for in her weekly reports. I walked 9 miles that first morning, carrying everything I owned in a borrowed flour sack, one wool blanket stamped with the county's ink, a change of clothes worn thin at the elbows, a stub of candle, and $1.82 in coins that clicked together with each step like a mocking little song. The road started as packed dirt between rail fences and cultivated fields. Within 2 miles, the fences ended. Within 4, the fields gave way to timber, second-growth oak and hickory, crowding the track like they wanted to take it back. The road got worse as I climbed. Packed dirt became ruts, then rocks, then nothing recognizable as a road at all. The last 2 miles were just a trace through the trees where wagon wheels had passed years ago and given up. Saplings grew in the wheel tracks now. No one had come this way in a long time. I stopped twice to rest. My legs weren't weak. I'd worked hard enough at the poor farm, but I wasn't used to climbing. The ridge rose ahead of me like a wall made of trees and gray stone. Limestone pushed through the thin soil in slabs and ledges, pale against the brown October leaves. I could see why no one farmed here. You couldn't drive a plow 10 feet without hitting rock. You couldn't plant a fence post without breaking your shovel. The air changed as I climbed higher, colder, thinner somehow, though that might have been my imagination. The wind cut through gaps in the trees with a sound like someone breathing out slow. No chimney smoke anywhere on the horizon, no dogs barking, no sound of axes or saws or any human work. Just the wind and my footsteps and the clink of coins in my pocket. I found the shack an hour before sunset. It leaned against the hillside like a drunk against a wall. One corner of the roof collapsed entirely. The cedar shingles curled in black with years of rot. The door had swollen shut with damp. I put my shoulder against it once, twice, 3 times, feeling the frame groan and resist before it finally gave with a sound like a man coughing. Inside smelled of mice and old smoke and something else I couldn't name yet, something cold and mineral, like the inside of a well. The single room was maybe 12 feet square. One window, shuttered and webbed with cracks. One stone hearth, blackened with decades of soot. One table, warped. One chair, missing a leg. Mouse nests in every corner, built from shredded newspaper and cloth, and the detritus of abandonment. The ceiling sagged where water had come through the ruined roof, and dark stains spread across the boards like maps of places I didn't want to go. But it was the back wall that stopped me. A gap ran along the bottom where the foundation stones had shifted, and through that gap I could feel air moving, not the draft from a cracked window, not the natural breathing of a building. This was something different. Cold air, steady and constant, pushing into the shack like the exhalation of something much larger than this little room. The source was obvious once I stepped outside and walked around the corner. The cave mouth opened 30 feet behind the shack, a dark wound in the limestone ridge maybe 20 feet wide and 12 feet tall. The stones around it were blackened with old fire. Someone had tried to smoke out animals once, or maybe just tried to see what was inside. The constant exhalation of cold air moved past my face as I stood at the entrance carrying the smell of wet limestone and age and things that had never seen sunlight. I lit my candle stub and walked inside. The main chamber was bigger than any building I'd ever entered, bigger than the church in Ridgewater, bigger than the poor farm's dining hall where 30 boys ate their meals in silence. My little flame guttered in the moving air but held, throwing shadows that jumped and crawled across walls I couldn't see the edges of. The ceiling rose maybe 15 feet at its peak, lost in darkness where my light couldn't reach. The floor was uneven limestone worn smooth in places, jagged in others, with pools of water standing in the low spots like black mirrors. Side passages opened in 3 directions, dark throats leading to places I couldn't imagine. The cold was constant, not freezing, not biting, just present, like a hand laid flat against my chest. 50 degrees, maybe. 55. The kind of cold that doesn't kill you fast, but wears you down over hours and days and weeks. The kind of cold that seeps into your bones and makes a home there. I understood, standing in that darkness, why everyone at the poor farm had laughed. You can't heat a cavern. The words formed in my head exactly as Mrs. Pettigrew had spoken them. A cavern this size, with passages leading God knows where, with air moving through it like breath through a throat. Any fire I lit would be a joke. The heat would rise and vanish into the darkness. The cold would rush in to replace it, endless and patient. You might as well try to warm the sky. I walked back to the shack as the last daylight faded. I stood in the doorway looking at the collapsed roof, the warped table, the mouse nest corners, the gap in the back wall where the cave's breath pushed through. This was my inheritance. This was what the court had given me. This was what everyone said was worse than nothing. I started a fire in the hearth that night, using deadfall I gathered from the slope. The chimney drew well enough, someone had built it properly once, and the flames gave light and a little warmth. But the cold kept coming through that gap in the back wall, persistent as a creditor, and by midnight I was shivering under my county blanket. Sometime after 3 in the morning, I got up to add wood to the fire. My candle had burned down to a nub. I lit a splinter from the hearth flames to see by, and that's when I noticed the stone. Behind the hearth, one stone sat different from the others. Not different in color or shape, they were all the same gray limestone, but different in how it fit. Looser, like someone had pulled it out and replaced it many times. I worked my fingers around the edges and felt the stone shift. I pulled it free and found a hollow space behind it, maybe a foot deep and twice as wide. The space was dry as bone despite all the damp everywhere else in the shack. Inside was a tin biscuit box, rusted at the edges but intact. Inside the box, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept them perfect through years of mountain winters, were 12 notebooks. They were numbered on the spines in faded ink, 1 through 12. The handwriting inside was small and careful, not the scrawl of a madman, not the shaky marks of someone losing his grip. Patient script, measured words, the handwriting of someone who expected to read his own words again someday. I opened the first notebook and read the date at the top of the first page. March 14th, 1887. My grandfather had been dead 3 months. He'd been writing in these notebooks for 28 years before he died. I carried the notebooks outside at first light, sat on a flat stone near the cave mouth where I could read without wasting my candle, and opened notebook 1. It was labeled on the inside cover in the same careful hand, air and temperature. The first entry was a list of measurements. Cave air at mouth, 54 degrees. Cave air at back chamber, 53 degrees. Outside air, 71 degrees. The cave does not care what the sky does. I kept reading, page after page of measurements taken across seasons, across years. Summer entries showed outside temperatures reaching 90 degrees, while the cave held steady at 54. Winter entries showed outside temperatures dropping below 0, while the cave held at 53. The numbers were remarkably consistent. The cave wasn't just cold, it was stable. Its own climate, sealed away from the world above, indifferent to drought or blizzard, or anything else the sky could throw at it. Silas had tracked the cave's breathing too. Arrows drawn on rough maps showed airflow patterns where the cold pushed out, where the drafts shifted between summer and winter. He'd written notes about the chimney effect, how temperature differences between the cave and the outside air created currents that pulled smoke and warmth away through passages that opened at different elevations on the ridge. But it was the entry from November 14th, 1891, that stopped my breath. The town believes a cave cannot be heated because the heat escapes. They are correct. A cave this size with passages that breathe will never hold warmth. The fire's heat rises, and the cold air rushes in to replace it. This is the chimney problem. I have written about it many times. Everyone who enters this cave feels it immediately. But I have been thinking about it wrong. Everyone has been thinking about it wrong. You cannot warm a cavern. You cannot heat a space this large, this open, this connected to tunnels that go miles into the ridge. The cave will win that fight every time. L'été, but you can warm a space inside it. A sealed room, stone walls, tight joints, small, no more than a man needs to live and work and sleep. The room is what you heat. The cave is what protects the room. Think of it this way. A house on the surface fights the wind, the snow, the rain, the sun. Every wall is a battlefield. The weather attacks from all sides, all the time. But a room inside a cave? The cave has already won those fights. No wind reaches the room. No snow loads the roof. The temperature outside the room is not 0 degrees or 100 degrees. It is always 53 degrees. You can't warm a cavern. Warm a circle inside it, and the mountain will do the rest. I read that last line 3 times. Then I looked up at the dark mouth of Cold Mouth Ridge, and I saw it differently. Not a hole that stole heat, a fortress that blocked wind, not an enemy. A shell. The cave wasn't the problem. The cave was the solution, if you understood what you were actually trying to solve. The next notebooks expanded the idea in ways that made my head swim. Notebook 2 was labeled Stone and Mortar. It described how to burn limestone into quickite, how to slake it into mortar, how to select and fit river cobbles so they locked together without gaps. Notebook 3 was Draft Paths, detailed maps of how air moved through the cave system, where the drafts were strongest, where they died away into pockets of still air. Notebook 4 was The Little Round House. In Notebook 4, I found drawings. Silas had sketched floor plans for a freestanding structure built on the cave floor. Round, he explained why in dense paragraphs about corners collecting cold air, about joints being weak points, about the mathematics of a circle enclosing the most space with the least perimeter. 12 feet across, with walls 2 feet thick, a small cast iron stove in the center, a sleeping platform raised off the damp cave floor, a single low doorway, oriented away from the prevailing draft. He'd calculated the stone needed, 300 river cobbles minimum, 400 to be safe. He'd calculated the lime, the mortar ratio, the cord feet of firewood required to keep the interior at 60 degrees when the cave held at 53 and the world outside dropped to 0. On the last page of Notebook 4, rendered in careful pencil lines, was a drawing of the completed cabin. It looked like a stone beehive squatting on the cave floor, round and solid and strange, nothing like any building I'd ever seen. Beside it, in handwriting that seemed to press harder into the paper, Silas had written, "The town calls me crazy. Let them. When the killing winter comes, they will understand." He'd been building toward this for 30 years. He'd hauled stones. He'd burned lime. He'd drawn plans and refined them and started over. And then, 3 months before I arrived, he'd caught pneumonia hauling rock in a sleet storm and died in his bed with the work unfinished. I read until the light failed, flipping through notebooks by touch, piecing together decades of observation and planning. I cried twice, once when I found an entry where Silas wrote about the townspeople laughing at him, and once when I found the note he'd left at the end of Notebook 12. It was dated September 3rd, 1915, 11 days before he died. If someone is reading this, I am gone. The roundhouse is not finished. The stone ring is laid, but the walls are not risen. I have failed to complete what I started 30 years ago, and the town will say I was a fool to the end. But if you are reading this, if someone has found these notebooks hidden where I put them, then maybe you can see what I saw. Maybe you understand that this cave is not a curse, but a gift. Maybe you will finish what I could not. The circle is waiting. The mountain is patient. Build your winter inside it. I sat on the cave floor with that notebook open on my knees and cried in a way I hadn't cried since my father died. Not from sadness. From the overwhelming recognition that someone like me had come before. Someone who saw what others couldn't see. Someone the world had mocked and dismissed and called crazy. And he had left everything he knew behind, hidden where only someone desperate enough to tear apart a hearth would ever find it. Silas Rourke hadn't left me a worthless inheritance. He'd left me a plan, a gift hidden inside a joke, and I was going to finish what he started. The decision was one thing, the reality was something else. Within a week, the cornmeal I'd brought was running low. I mixed it thinner each day, mush in the morning, nothing at midday, mush at night that was mostly water by the end. I set snares along the ridge track, using techniques I half remembered from a book I'd read at the poor farm. 5 snares, checked twice daily. 4 came up empty day after day. 1 caught a rabbit in the second week, thin and tough, but I ate every scrap including the organs and boiled the bones for broth. October turned cold and stayed cold. The shack was barely shelter. I stuffed moss and mud into every gap I could find, but the cave still breathed through that crack in the back wall, pushing 53-degree air into the room hour after hour. Damp crept into everything. My blanket never fully dried. My clothes grew a smell of mildew I couldn't wash out. I burned through my small stock of firewood just trying to keep the shack above freezing, then spent entire days dragging deadfall from the slopes to stay ahead of the cold. I read the notebooks every night, planning work I wasn't sure I had the strength to do. The lowest point came in the third week of October. I woke one morning with frost on my blanket, not condensation from the damp air. Frost, white crystals on the wool, sparkling in the gray light that came through the cracked shutter. The temperature outside had dropped into the 20s. The shack's walls weren't walls at all, just suggestions of walls, and the cave's breath had lowered the interior to something that made my teeth chatter. My fingers were too stiff to light a fire. I sat wrapped in everything I owned, blanket, spare shirt, coat I'd sewn together from rags, and tried to work feeling back into my hands. It took nearly an hour. I thought about the poor farm the whole time. The warm dining hall. The beds with actual mattresses. The meals that appeared 3 times a day whether you deserved them or not. All I had to do was walk back. 9 miles. Knock on the door. Tell Mrs. Pettigrew she was right, the cave was worthless, I was worthless, could I please have my cot back? But I knew what would happen if I did that. The older boys would laugh, the staff would shake their heads, and Mrs. Pettigrew would look at me with those pale eyes and say something like, "I told you so," without ever using those words. Begging only teaches people they were right about you. I'd learned that in the houses that sent me away. I'd learned it in the dormitory, where boys took things from smaller boys because smaller boys couldn't stop them. What saved me that morning wasn't pride. It was Notebook 7. I'd read it the night before, squinting in the firelight. Silas had written about a November in 1894 when he nearly gave up. His wife Mary had died that spring. His sons wanted nothing to do with him or his cave. The town's mockery had become something worse, pity, which he hated more than laughter. He'd written, "I thought about leaving the ridge and never coming back, selling the land for whatever anyone would pay, walking away from everything I'd built and observed and planned. Then I walked into the cave and stood in the dark. I felt the air moving, 53 degrees, the same as yesterday, the same as it will be tomorrow. The mountain doesn't care if I'm sad. The mountain doesn't care if I'm foolish or wise or anything in between. The mountain just is." And I decided to be the same way, to just be, to keep working, to let the people who laughed go on laughing while I went on building. The circle is not for them. The circle is for whoever comes after, whoever finds these notebooks, whoever sees what I see. That person will understand. And if no one ever comes, if I die and these notebooks rot and the cave swallows everything I've built, the mountain won't care about that either. The mountain will just be, and so will the work I put into it. I didn't have much to be, but I had the notebooks. I had a plan someone else had already drawn, and I had nowhere else to go. I found a spring that week, a trickle of water seeping from limestone 50 yards below the cave mouth, cold and clear and tasting of stone. I found ramps growing in a hollow on the south face of the ridge, their green leaves bright against the brown October forest. I found a patch of late blackberries, small and hard, but edible. The ridge wasn't generous, but it wasn't killing me either. Not yet. I ate what I could find. I kept the fire going. I read the notebooks until I had them memorized. And when the worst of the cold passed and the October sun came out pale and thin, I picked up a pry bar and walked into the cave. If I was going to die on Cold Mouth Ridge, I was going to die building. Silas's notebooks called it the foundation ring, a base of fitted stones, level and solid, 12 feet across, laid on the cave floor where the round cabin would rise. The cave floor wasn't flat. It was limestone worn by water that had flowed here thousands of years before I was born, full of humps and hollows and pools of standing water. I started with a borrowed pry bar and a sledgehammer I'd traded my pocket knife for in Ridgewater. The man at the hardware store had looked at me like I was crazy when I described what I wanted. "Breaking rock," he'd said, "on Silas's ridge." He'd laughed, not mean, just tired, the laugh of someone who'd seen foolish boys before. Good luck with that. The work was brutal. I broke up the worst of the limestone humps, crack by crack, until my arms shook and my hands blistered and my back seized up so badly one morning I couldn't straighten for an hour. I filled the hollows with gravel I carried from the creek bed 2 miles down the ridge, load by load, a journey that took half a day each time. The cold made everything harder. My fingers went numb. My joints ached. I moved like an old man, and I was 15 years old. But the floor got level, inch by inch, stone by stone, day by day. The next problem was the building stones. Silas's notebook specified river cobbles, rounded stones worn smooth by water, easier to stack and fit than jagged limestone. The nearest river was 2 miles down the ridge, a hard scramble through timber and across 2 ravines. I could carry maybe 5 good stones at a time, 30 or 40 pounds across my shoulders. Each trip took half a day if I didn't stop to rest. I learned to stop to rest. I counted them as I stacked them beside the cave mouth. 10 stones. 20. 50. The pile grew like a cairn marking a grave that hadn't been dug yet. By the end of the 3rd week, I had 112 stones. By the 4th week, 170. By the 1st of November, I had 204 river cobbles stacked in a ragged pyramid near the cave mouth and the beginnings of a wall. The first course was the hardest. I mixed lime mortar the way Silas described in Notebook 2, burning limestone in a rough kiln until it calcined to powder, then slaking it with water in a wooden trough until it turned to paste. The chemistry was beyond me, but the results weren't. The paste hardened like rock when it dried, binding the cobbles together into something stronger than either stone or lime alone. I laid the first stones in a circle on the leveled floor, checking and rechecking my measurements against Silas's drawings. 12 feet across, walls 2 feet thick at the base. Each stone fitted tight against its neighbors, joints filled with mortar, the whole thing rising in courses like a layer cake made of rock. 6 inches, 12 inches, knee-high. The wall took shape around me. That's when the smoke almost killed me. I'd installed the stove in the 4th week, a small cast-iron box I'd bought on credit from the Ridgewater hardware store, promising to pay with pelts I hadn't yet trapped from animals I hadn't yet caught. The stovepipe ran up through a gap I'd left in the planned roof area, angled toward a natural crevice in the cave ceiling where Silas's notes said an updraft would pull smoke away. The first fire seemed to work. I lit kindling in the stove's belly and watched smoke rise through the pipe, curl into the crevice, and disappear into darkness. I felt heat radiating from the cast iron, warming the air inside the half-built walls. The cave's cold breath still moved around me, but inside the circle something was changing. I put my palm against the stove and felt heat I had made, heat I controlled. I thought, this is it. This is what Silas meant, the circle inside the cave. I don't remember lying down. I don't remember the fire dying. I don't remember anything after that first hour except waking up on the cave floor outside the circle, vomit on my shirt, a headache that felt like an axe was splitting my skull from the inside. I crawled toward the light at the cave mouth, unable to stand, my vision swimming. The cold air hit my face and I gulped it like water. I lay on the stones outside the cave for 20 minutes, maybe 30, waiting for my heart to stop hammering and my vision to clear. The smoke hadn't gone up through the crevice. Some of it had, enough to fool me, but the rest had been pooling in the low spaces of the cave, filling the air with poison I couldn't see or smell. Carbon monoxide. I didn't know that term then. I just knew I'd almost died in my sleep. I'd been lucky. Another hour and I would have been a body on the cave floor, another skeleton on Cold Mouth Ridge, another joke for the people of Ridgewater to tell about the foolish Rourke boy who tried to live in a hole in the ground. I didn't touch the stove for 3 days. I slept in the shack with the back gap stuffed shut, shivering through nights that dropped into the 20s, rereading Silas's notebooks about draft paths and airflow and trying to understand what I'd done wrong. On the morning of the 4th day, Harlan Boone walked up the ridge track. I heard him before I saw him, a slow, steady tread on loose stone, the tap of a walking stick, the wheeze of old lungs working hard against the climb. He came around the bend in the trace, looking like something the forest had grown, stooped at the shoulders, face like weathered oak, hands like gnarled roots gripping a stick worn smooth by years of use. 72 years old, though I didn't know that then. I just knew he was old in a way that suggested he'd earned every year of it. He stopped at the cave mouth and looked at the smoke stain on the limestone above the entrance. I'd been venting the cook fire from the shack, and the residue had left a dark smear on the pale stone. "That ain't right," he said. No greeting, no introduction, no explanation for how he'd known to come here. "Who taught you to set a flue?" "Notebooks," I said. "My grandfather's." He nodded slowly, like the answer didn't surprise him. "Silas Rourke." Not a question, a fact. I helped him burn lime once, 20 years back before his wife died. He looked at me, really looked, not the way townspeople looked when they wanted to measure your weakness or calculate your worth. "You the boy the county gave his land to?" "I'm the boy everyone laughed at." "Same thing." He walked past me into the cave, his stick tapping on the stone floor like he was testing it for hollows. I followed. He stood in front of my half-built wall for a long time without speaking. The courses were uneven. The mortar was thick in some places, thin in others. A child's work, an amateur's work. But it was standing, and it was rising, and it was round. "Your granddaddy weren't building a joke," Harlan said finally. His voice echoed slightly in the cave, bouncing off walls I couldn't see. "He was building a winter." I didn't know what to say, so I said nothing. "Your flue's wrong." He was already moving toward the stove, examining the pipe, the angle, the crevice above. "You got the direction right, but you ain't got the draw. Cave air moves different than house air. There's a pressure in here, a weight the outside air don't have. You need a collar at the transition, something to push the smoke up into the updraft before the cave can steal it sideways and pool it where you sleep." He looked at me. "You got any more of that lime?" "Some. Mix more. We got work to do." Harlan came back the next day, and the day after that, and every day for the next 3 weeks. He never asked if I wanted help. He never offered explanation or expected thanks. He just appeared at the cave mouth each morning, walking stick in hand, tool bag over his shoulder, and worked beside me until the light failed. He taught me things the notebooks couldn't teach. How to listen for air leaks with a wet hand, the cold spots where drafts found gaps in the mortar. How to seat stones so they locked together, each one sharing the weight of its neighbors rather than fighting it. How to read the mortar as it dried, too wet and it slumped between the stones, too dry and it cracked and crumbled just right, and it found the stone like it had always been there. "Stone don't want to be dry stacked," he said one afternoon, watching me fit a cobble into place. "And it don't want to swim in mortar neither. Stone wants to be partnered, each one leaning on the next, each one holding up what comes after." We rebuilt the flue collar together, a clay pipe Harlan had salvaged from somewhere, fitted into a limestone collar that seated tight against the cave's natural updraft crevice. We sealed the joints with mortar and then sealed them again with clay. When we lit the test fire, I held my breath for the first 30 seconds. The smoke rose, curled into the pipe, found the collar, and vanished into the updraft like it had somewhere to be. No pooling, no poison, just warmth rising, and the cave breathing around us without stealing what we'd made. The stove glowed orange in the darkness. The stones of the wall, 2 feet thick now, began to absorb the heat. I put my palm against the inner surface and felt something I'd never felt before in that cave. Warmth that had nowhere to go but into more stone. "Thermal mass," Harlan said, watching me. "That's what the science folks call it. Stone holds heat, lets it go slow. Like a bank you put heat in, and it pays you back through the night." He coughed, a deep rattle in his chest that he tried to hide. "Your granddaddy understood that. Most folks don't." I didn't know the term, but I understood the principle. The stones weren't just walls. They were batteries. The stove charged them all day, and they released their charge through the night, steady and patient, long after the fire burned down. By the first week of November, the walls had reached shoulder height. By the third week, they were complete. a dome of fitted river cobbles, chinked and mortared, with a single low doorway that faced away from the prevailing draft. The roof was the hardest part. Harlan taught me to corbel the stones inward, each course stepping slightly toward the center, until the dome narrowed to a gap I could cap with a single flat stone. The day we set the capstone, I crawled inside with a candle and sat on the cold floor. The space was maybe 12 feet across, the ceiling 8 feet at its peak where the capstone sealed it shut. A stone sleeping platform rose against one wall, lifted 18 inches off the ground to escape the damp. The stove squatted in the center, its pipe running up and out through the collar. I lit a fire. A small one, 3 sticks of split oak, nothing more. Within an hour, the temperature inside the round cabin had climbed to 60 degrees. Outside the circle, in the cave's main chamber, the air held steady at 53. And outside the cave, November had brought nights that bit at any exposed skin with temperatures in the 30s. I sat in shirt sleeves in a stone room inside a mountain. Warm. Harlan wasn't there to see it. He'd gone back down to Ridgewater that afternoon, his cough worse than usual. But when he returned the next morning and stepped through the low doorway, he stood in the center of the round cabin for a long time without speaking. "Your granddaddy was right," he said finally. "The old fool was right all along." That night I slept without shivering for the first time since I'd arrived on Cold Mouth Ridge. The fire burned down around midnight, and I didn't wake until dawn. When I did, the stones were still warm to the touch. The temperature inside had dropped from 60 to 57 degrees, 4 degrees above the cave, and barely a degree cooler than when I'd gone to sleep. I had built a house inside a mountain, and the mountain, indifferent to my foolishness or my wisdom, had decided to help. But the round cabin was only shelter for one. It hadn't fed me through a winter. It hadn't proven anything to anyone except an old stonemason who already believed. The people of Ridgewater still called Cold Mouth Ridge a joke. Etta Sloan at the general store still wrinkled her nose when I came in to buy supplies on credit. The boys who'd laughed in the poor farm dining hall still thought I was living in a wet hole in the ground. And the worst winter in 50 years was still 3 months away. Harlan sat on a stone outside the cave mouth that morning, watching the ridge track as if expecting someone. I brought him chicory coffee I'd boiled on the stove, another small miracle, hot coffee in November from a cave everyone said couldn't be heated. "Storm coming," he said, not looking at the sky, looking at me. "Not today, not this month, but it's coming. I can feel it in my joints the way my daddy could feel it in his." "What kind of storm?" "The kind that tests everything you've built. The kind that separates what works from what don't." He sipped the coffee. "The kind that kills people." I looked back at the round cabin in the darkness of the cave, solid and snug, heat still radiating from its stones into the cold air. It was enough for me, for now. But Harlan was right. The real test hadn't come, and I had a feeling that more than my survival would depend on what I'd built. Harlan hadn't told me yet about his son, how the mines took his lungs, how he'd watched the boy cough himself to death before 30. He hadn't told me about playing checkers with Silas in the old days, about the letters Silas had written that nobody answered, about the years he'd watched my grandfather work alone on a project the whole county called madness. Those stories would come later, in the long hours of building and waiting, but I saw it in his face that morning, even if I didn't understand it yet. He wasn't just here because he believed in the round cabin. He was here because he believed in finishing things, in seeing work through to the end, in not dying with a half-built dream on a ridge where nobody ever came. The mountain held steady at 53 degrees. The round cabin held at 57, and somewhere to the north, a winter was building that would test both of us in ways I couldn't imagine. Chunk 2 continues. Harlan told me about his son on a December afternoon when the wind outside the cave howled like something wounded. We were fitting the last stones of a storage shelf into the cabin wall, a place to keep food where the mice couldn't reach it. His hands moved slower than they had a month ago. The cough was worse. "The mines took Daniel," he said, not looking at me. "Coal dust in the lungs. They call it black lung now, but we didn't have a name for it then. Just watched him get thinner and shorter of breath until one morning he didn't wake up." He set a stone in place, checked its seat with his fingertips. He was 28 years old, younger than I was when I had him. I didn't say I was sorry. Harlan wasn't the kind of man who wanted sorry. He wanted the stone to fit right. Your granddaddy knew Daniel, he continued. Used to bring him up here when he was small. Let him play in the cave mouth while we burned lime and talked about what Silas was building. He coughed, that deep rattle again. Silas wrote to me after Daniel died. Said there was room on the ridge if I wanted to get away from town. Said the cave had a way of making grief quieter. Did you come? No. He fitted another stone. I was too proud. Thought staying in town proved something, proved I could take it. He looked at me for the first time since he'd started talking. Pride's a poor substitute for warmth, Tom. Remember that. That night he taught me how to read stone the way he read it, by touch, by sound, by the way it took the mortar. He showed me where to find the hairline cracks that meant a cobble would split under pressure, and how to test a stone's ring by tapping it with a hammer. A good stone sang. A bad stone thudded. Your hands will know before your eyes do, he said. Give it time. He was right. By January, my hands had become something I didn't recognize. Calluses thick as leather on my palms, knuckles swollen from cold and work, nails cracked and dirty no matter how much I scrubbed them. But those hands knew the stones. They could find a gap in the mortar by touch alone. They could seat a cobble without looking. Harlan's hands were slowing down. I pretended not to notice. The round cabin was finished, but I wasn't done building. Silas's notebooks described improvements I hadn't attempted yet. A second stove for cooking, a ventilation system that would bring fresh air without losing heat, a cistern to catch water from the cave's natural seepage. I worked through December and into January, hauling stones, mixing mortar, learning as I went. The food situation improved. I'd traded 2 days of labor at the Ridgewater sawmill for supplies. Cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, a small bag of coffee that felt like luxury. The work had nearly killed me. 10 hours swinging a cant hook in freezing rain, but the food would last a month if I was careful. I was always careful now. By mid-January, I had the second stove installed and the fresh air channel cut through the cabin wall. The cave floor was taking shape too. I'd laid flat stones in a path from the entrance to the cabin and built a low wall around the cooking area to catch sparks. The round cabin was becoming a home. That's when Etta Sloan came up the ridge. I heard her before I saw her, the crunch of boots on frozen ground, the labored breathing of someone not used to climbing. She appeared at the cave mouth wearing a wool coat too thin for the weather and an expression I'd seen before. The expression of someone who'd come to confirm what they already believed. So this is it, she said, looking past me into the darkness. The boy playing house in a hole. I didn't answer. I'd learned that silence worked better than defense. She walked into the cave without asking permission, her boots echoing on the stone floor. She stopped at the round cabin and stared at it for a long moment. The fire was burning low inside, the stones still radiating warmth from the morning. It's warm, she said. Not a question. An accusation. 58 degrees inside, 31 outside. That ain't natural. She pulled her coat tighter. A cave this big shouldn't hold heat. Everyone knows that. The cave doesn't hold the heat. The cabin does. The cave just stops the wind. She looked at me the way she looked at boys who stole penny candy, like I was trying to trick her. Your granddaddy said things like that. The mountain will do the rest. Made him sound touched in the head. He wasn't touched. He was right. Etta Sloan sniffed. We'll see about that when the real cold comes. She turned to leave, then stopped at the cave mouth. That hole'll eat your heat and your mind with it. Mark my words. I watched her pick her way back down the track. Then I went inside the cabin, added wood to the fire, and got back to work. February brought Asa Kettering. He was the county school teacher, a thin man with spectacles and a way of asking questions that made you feel like the answer mattered. He'd heard about the cave from someone in town, and he'd walked 6 miles through snow to see it for himself. I showed him everything, the notebooks, the flue system, the thermal mass of the walls, the way the cave's constant temperature reduced the work the stove had to do. He listened without interrupting, making notes in a little book he carried in his coat pocket. When I finished, he stood in the center of the round cabin and looked around like he was seeing something I couldn't see. "This is remarkable," he said. "Not magic, not madness, just honest heat kept where it belongs." He tapped the wall with his knuckles. "Your grandfather understood something most people miss. The problem was never the cave. The problem was trying to heat the wrong space." That's what his notebooks say. His notebooks should be published. Kettering wrote something in his little book. "I'm going to write about this for the church bulletin. People should know what you've built here." I didn't know if that was a good thing or a bad thing, but it felt like something had shifted, like a stone settling into place after a long time loose. Wade came 3 days later. I was splitting wood outside the cave when I heard hoofbeats on the track. Wade Rourke sat his horse like a man who owned everything he could see, which, in a sense, he did. His timber holdings stretched across 2 valleys. His house in Ridgewater had glass windows and a hired girl. He was 43 years old and had never done a day's work that didn't make him richer. He was also my half-brother, though neither of us liked to acknowledge it. "Tom." He didn't dismount. He looked at the cave mouth, at the smoke rising from the hidden flue, at the neat stack of firewood I'd spent a week building. "Still playing at this, I see." "Still building." "Building what? A monument to our father's foolishness?" He shifted in the saddle. "Sign the land over to me. I'll give you $50 and a ticket to anywhere you want to go." "The land's not for sale." "Everything's for sale." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "You're squatting on family shame, Tom. Every day you stay here, you remind people that Rourke's came from a crazy old man who talked to rocks." "Silas wasn't crazy. Silas died hauling stones in a sleet storm. If that's not crazy, I don't know what is." Wade leaned forward in his saddle. "Last offer. $50 and a fresh start. Take it, or I'll have the sheriff up here for trespass." "It's my land. The court said so." "Courts can be wrong." He turned his horse. "You're building a child's fort in a wet cave, Tom. When the real winter comes, you'll freeze, and nobody will come looking." He rode down the track without looking back. I watched him until he disappeared around the bend, then I went back to splitting wood. My hands were shaking, but not from the cold. The real winter came in late December of 1917. It started with a stillness. The birds stopped singing. The wind that usually whispered through the gaps in the ridge went silent. The sky turned a color I'd never seen before, not gray, not white, but something in between, heavy and waiting. Harlan felt it first. "Get wood inside," he said that morning. "All you can carry. Do it now." I didn't ask why. I spent the day hauling firewood from my stack into the cave, piling it along the walls, filling every space that wasn't needed for walking or sleeping. By nightfall, I had 3 weeks' worth of fuel inside the mountain. Harlan had gone back to town to warn people, his cough worse than ever. The temperature dropped 30 degrees in 6 hours. I woke at midnight to a sound like the world ending, wind slamming against the ridge with a force I could feel through solid stone. The cave mouth howled. Snow drove horizontal past the entrance, so thick I couldn't see the trees 20 feet away. The thermometer I'd hung outside read 4 degrees below zero and falling. Inside the round cabin, the fire crackled. The stones radiated their stored warmth. The temperature held at 59 degrees. I added wood and went back to sleep. By morning, the thermometer outside read 22 below zero. The snow had drifted 8 feet deep against the ridge. Nothing moved in the white world beyond the cave. No birds, no animals, no sign of human life. The track to Ridgewater had vanished under drifts that would take days to clear. I had food for 3 weeks, fuel for longer, water seeping from the limestone spring, and a cabin that held steady at 57 degrees while the world outside tried to kill everything in it. The question was whether anyone else had been as lucky. The answer came on the 3rd day. I was clearing snow from the cave mouth when I saw movement on the ridge, a dark shape struggling through drifts that came to the waist. Then another shape, then 3 more. They moved slowly, bent against the wind, and as they got closer I saw they were carrying something. Someone. Clarice Rourke reached the cave first, Wade's wife. She was carrying her youngest child under a quilt, the boy's face blue-white with cold. Behind her came her eldest daughter, then 2 neighbor children, then Etta Sloan with her mother on a makeshift sled. Clarice looked at me. I remembered her face from the day after my father died, the day I'd knocked on her door asking for a corner to sleep in, and she'd said, "Not here," and closed the door without meeting my eyes. I stepped aside and held the cave entrance open. "Inside," I said. "The cabin's warm." She didn't thank me. She didn't apologize. She just carried her son into the darkness toward the glow of firelight, and I followed her in. The line started that afternoon and didn't stop for 3 weeks. Ridgewater was dying. The cold had come too fast and too hard. Wells froze. Pipes burst. Woodpiles that should have lasted a month were gone in days. The Petersons' chimney cracked on the second night and filled their house with smoke. They fled into temperatures that gave you frostbite in 10 minutes. The Brannons' roof collapsed under the snow weight. The poor farm's boiler failed on day 4, and Mrs. Pettigrew found herself with 23 residents and no way to keep them alive. They came to the cave because there was nowhere else to go. First, it was Clarice and the children. Then, Etta Sloan with her mother, whose hands had turned blue and wouldn't warm. Then the Peterson family. Then the Brannons. Then faces I recognized from the general store, from the church, from the streets of a town that had laughed at Silas Rourke for 30 years. The round cabin held 12 people that first week. We built fires in the main cave chamber, smaller than I would have liked. The smoke was always a concern, but enough to take the edge off for those who couldn't fit inside the cabin. I rationed my food and found it went further than I expected. People had brought what they could carry, and we pooled everything. The cave held at 53 degrees. The cabin held at 56 with 12 bodies and a low fire. Outside, the thermometer dropped to 37 below zero on the worst night, a number I had to read twice because I didn't believe it. Mrs. Pettigrew arrived on day 7, leading a procession of poor farm residents on sleds. She didn't look at me when she came through the cave mouth. She just counted heads, assigned sleeping spaces, and started organizing the food supply with the same efficiency she'd used to manage misery for 30 years. I let her. There were more important things to worry about. Harlan Boone came on day 9. He'd stayed in town trying to help, and the effort had broken something in him. He could barely walk. His cough had turned into something wet and deep that made everyone who heard it look away. I gave him the warmest spot in the cabin, near the stove, and he slept for 2 days straight. On the 3rd day, he woke up, looked around at the cave full of people, and said, "You did it, Tom. You built a winner." Wade Rourke came on day 12. I was outside the cabin, stoking one of the secondary fires we'd built in the main chamber, when I heard his voice. He was standing near the cave mouth, his fine wool coat torn, his face raw from cold, his eyes fixed on the round cabin like he was seeing something impossible. "Tom." His voice was hoarse. He stopped. Started again. "Clarice and the children, are they?" "Inside, warm, fed." He nodded. Looked at the cabin again, looked at me. $50, he said. "I offered you $50 to sign this over." I remember. "I would have let you freeze." He said it flat, like he was reading from a list. "I would have bought this land at the tax sale and torn down everything the old man built. I would have—" He stopped again. His jaw worked. "My children are alive because of a cave I called worthless." I could have said something cruel. I had earned the right to cruelty, and we both knew it. But I looked at Wade Rourke standing in the mouth of a cave he'd mocked for 40 years, and I felt something I didn't expect. I felt tired, not angry, not triumphant, just tired. "There's space by the east wall," I said. "The fire's smaller there, but it's dry." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he walked past me into the cave, and I went back to stoking the fire. The storm lasted 3 weeks. When it finally broke and the temperatures climbed back above zero, we counted the dead. 11 people in Ridgewater and the surrounding valleys, 3 children. A family of 5 who'd tried to walk to the next town and didn't make it. An old man who'd refused to leave his house and frozen in his bed. In the cave, everyone lived, not easily, not comfortably. We ran low on food twice and had to organize hunting parties into the frozen forest. 2 people got sick with fevers that scared me more than the cold. Etta Sloane's mother lost 2 fingers to frostbite she'd gotten before they reached the cave. But everyone who made it to Coldmouth Ridge walked back down again when the thaw came. The day the last family left, I stood at the cave mouth and watched them pick their way down the track through snow that was finally starting to melt. Harlan stood beside me, leaning heavily on his stick, his breathing shallow and wet. "The cold didn't ask who deserved it," I said. "So I didn't either." Harlan nodded slowly. "Your granddaddy would have done the same." I thought about Clarice Rourke closing her door in my face, about Etta Sloane telling me the cave would eat my mind, about Wade offering $50 for land he planned to destroy, about Mrs. Pettigrew reading me the verdict of the court while boys laughed and slapped the table. I had kept them all warm, I had kept them all alive, and I hadn't asked for a single thing in return. "They didn't deserve it," Harlan said, watching the last of them disappear around the bend. "Maybe not," I said, "but the cave doesn't know that." Mrs. Pettigrew came back 3 days later, alone this time. No residents, no sleds, no official business. She walked up the track slowly, like she was thinking about turning around with every step. I was inside the round cabin when I heard her call my name. I came out to find her standing in the main chamber, looking at the walls I'd built, the paths I'd laid, the infrastructure of survival I'd created out of nothing. "Thomas," she said. She was holding a tin box I recognized, a biscuit tin, rusted at the edges. "Mrs. Pettigrew." "I was wrong about you." She said it stiffly, like the words cost her something. "I was wrong about your grandfather. I was wrong about this place." I waited. There was more coming. I could see it in the way she held that tin box, her knuckles white against the rust. "Silas wrote to me," she said. 2 years before he died. He wrote asking if you could come live with him on the ridge. He said he'd teach you stonework. He said he'd give you the notebooks early, show you what he was building. She set the tin box on a stone ledge. "I never gave you the letter." The cave was very quiet. The fire crackled behind me. Water dripped somewhere in the darkness. "Why?" "Because I thought he was crazy. Because I thought you were better off with me in a proper institution, learning proper discipline." Her voice cracked on the last word. "Because I decided for you, and I was wrong." She opened the tin box and took out a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. She held it out to me. I didn't take it. Not yet. 2 years, I said. I spent 2 years in that place, eating food that was never enough, sleeping in a room with boys who stole anything they could take. 2 years, and someone wanted me. Someone was asking for me. My voice stayed steady. I was surprised by how steady it stayed. "And you kept it in a box?" "Yes." "Because you decided I was better off?" "Yes." The paper trembled in her hand. I could see Silas's handwriting through the thin sheet, the same careful script I knew from the notebooks, the same patient hand. I took the letter. I didn't read it. Not then. I just held it and felt the weight of 2 years I couldn't get back. "I forgive you," I said. "Not because you were right, because I'm tired of carrying you." She looked at me for a long moment. Then she nodded once, turned, and walked back down the track toward Ridgewater. I sat in the round cabin that night and read Silas's letter by firelight. He'd written about the cave, about the work, about the circle inside the mountain, but mostly he'd written about me, about a boy he'd never met who shared his blood and might share his way of seeing things. If the boy has any of his father's stubbornness, he'd written, he'll do fine here. If he has any of my patience, he'll understand what I've built. And if he has both, he might be the one to finish it. I folded the letter and put it in the biscuit tin with the notebooks. Then I added wood to the fire and watched the stones glow with stored heat. Harlan Boone died in April, when the dogwoods were blooming on the lower slopes. I found him on his stool inside the round cabin, a bowl of broth I'd made still warm on the shelf beside him. His eyes were closed. His hands rested on his knees. He looked like he was waiting for something, and it had finally come. I buried him on the ridge above the cave, where the morning sun hit first. I dug the grave myself, through soil that was still cold from winter, and I laid stones around the edge the way he'd taught me to lay stones, each one partnered with the next, each one sharing the weight. I planted a hemlock sapling on the grave, a tree that belonged to cold places. I kept his mason's hammer on a shelf in the cabin. I still have it. The handle's worn smooth from two sets of hands now, his and mine. The years after that moved differently, slower in some ways, faster in others. Asa Kettering wrote about the cave for more than the church bulletin. He sent letters to the state agricultural office, to the university in Morgantown, to anyone who might care about a stone cabin inside a mountain that had kept 40 people alive through the worst winter in 50 years. Some of them wrote back. A few of them visited. I married Rose Kettering in the spring of 1920, Asa's younger sister, a woman who read books the way other women read recipes, and who never once asked me to explain why I spent more time in a cave than in town. She moved to the ridge and we built a second cabin outside the cave mouth, a proper cabin with windows and a porch. The round cabin became our winter retreat, our cellar, our refuge when the weather turned. We had 3 children. They grew up knowing the cave the way I knew it, not as a curse or a joke, but as a gift someone had hidden inside a joke. Ridgewater changed around us. The railroad expanded, then contracted. The timber industry boomed, then collapsed. Wars came and went. The town that had laughed at Silas Rourke got smaller every year, and the people who remembered the Great Freeze of 1917 got older, and eventually there weren't many left who could tell the story firsthand. But the cave stayed. The round cabin stayed. 53 degrees in the main chamber, year after year, century after century. The mountain didn't care about wars or railroads or the price of lumber. The mountain just held steady, the way it always had. I taught stonework to 3 apprentices over the years. One of them built a similar shelter in a cave over in Monroe County. Another wrote a pamphlet about thermal mass that got passed around the agricultural extension offices. The third just wanted to know how to build a chimney that drew properly, and I figured that was enough. My hands got old the way Harlan's had gotten old. Slower, stiffer. But they still knew stone. They could still find a gap in the mortar by touch, still seat a cobble without looking. Some things don't leave you, even when everything else does. Rose died in 1951, in her sleep, in the bed we'd shared for 30 years. I buried her next to Harlan under a second hemlock. The ridge was becoming a cemetery for people I loved. I didn't mind. There were worse things than keeping company with the dead. I died on a Tuesday morning in March of 1958. The dogwoods were blooming early that year, white flowers against the gray woods, and I'd walked up to Harlan's grave to see them. My daughter found me kneeling in the soil near the hemlock, my hands in the dirt like I was checking for something. She said later that I looked peaceful. She said I looked like I was listening. The round cabin still stands. My grandson maintains it now. He brings school groups up the ridge every spring to see it, and he tells them the story of a boy who inherited a worthless cave and turned it into a winter. He shows them the notebooks in their glass case at the Ridgewater Historical Society, and he reads them Silas's words. You can't warm a cavern. Warm a circle inside it, and the mountain will do the rest. The mountain still holds at 53 degrees. It will hold at 53 degrees long after everyone who reads this is gone. That's what mountains do. They outlast us. They keep our secrets. They turn our small defiance into something that endures. So let me ask you something. What cave have you been standing outside of? What worthless thing did someone hand you, laughing, expecting you to fail? What piece of land, what project, what dream did they call a joke because they couldn't see what you saw? Maybe it's not a cave. Maybe it's a skill nobody thinks will pay. An idea everyone says is too strange. A place everyone says is too hard. A part of yourself everyone says is too different to be worth anything. What circle could you build inside it? I'm not talking about warming the whole cavern. Nobody can do that. I'm not talking about changing everyone's mind or proving the whole world wrong. That's not how it works. The people who laughed at Silas Rourke mostly died still laughing. The people who called me a fool mostly never admitted they were wrong. But I didn't build the round cabin for them. I built it for the people who came in from the cold. I built it for the children who slept warm while the world froze outside. I built it for my grandfather, who died before he could see it finished. I built it for myself because I needed somewhere to stand. The conditions don't have to be perfect. They almost never are. Silas Rourke had a cave that breathed cold air and a town that called him crazy. I had $1.82 and a borrowed flour sack. We built anyway. The surface is the least interesting part of any piece of land, and the surface is the least interesting part of any human being. The valuable stuff is underneath, in the notebooks hidden behind the hearth, in the aquifer under the limestone, in the stubborn patience that keeps working when everyone else has given up. If this story moved something in you, if it made you think about your own sealed caves and rusted tin boxes, hit subscribe. There are more stories like this one. Stories about ordinary people who built extraordinary things in the places everyone else had given up on. Your cave is waiting. The mountain doesn't care if you're foolish or wise. The mountain will hold steady at 53 degrees, and it will do its part, and all you have to do is build your circle inside it. Start building.